relationship between the two countries. U.S. Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner leads the economic part of the talks. Wang Qishan represents China. He is Vice Premier of the State Council of China. He oversees the economy, financial affairs, and foreign trade. He is a member of the 25-person Politburo, which sets policy for the government and the Communist Party. He is a former mayor of Beijing and has been the go-to guy for the Chinese government on everything from SARS, the Olympics, and the banking crisis in Guangdong. At the opening session today, Wang and Secretary Geithner reaffirmed the importance of the U.S.-China relationship.
We have far more shared interests and cooperation than differences in competition.
The reforms we must both pursue to meet these very different challenges are not in conflict, and the strengths of our economies are still largely complementary. And we each recognize that our ability to work together is important to the overall health and stability of the global economy.
Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who is heading the foreign policy talks, and Vice President Joe Biden spoke to the issue of China's human rights policy.
We know over the long arc of history that societies that work toward respecting human rights are going to be more prosperous, stable, and successful. That has certainly been proven time and time again, but most particularly in the last months.
As I said, I recognize that some in China see our advocacy as human rights as an intrusion, and Lord only knows what else. But President Obama and I believe strongly, as does the Secretary, that protecting fundamental rights and freedoms, such as those enshrined in China's international commitments, as well as in China's own constitution, is the best way to promote long-term stability and prosperity.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner and Chinese Vice Premier Wang Qishan join me now in Washington for their first joint interview and the first interview in the United States for the Vice Premier. What do you hope to accomplish in this session, and how do you assess where the relationship is today?
我觉得两国关系在经过
Over the past 3 decades and more since the establishment of China-U.S. diplomatic relations, our relationship has indeed experienced twists and turns. But what is more important is that today it is heading towards greater maturity. And it was culminated by the visit to the United States by President Hu Jintao back in January. And the two presidents reached an important agreement to build a China-U.S. cooperative partnership based on mutual benefit and mutual respect. And 4 months later, I'm here in the United States for the third round of the China-U.S. strategic and economic dialogues. Actually, Secretary Geithner and I had a previous agreement about the major tasks we are going to accomplish during this round of the dialogues. That is to say, at this round of the dialogues, the two of us, we are going to follow through on the important agreements reached by the two presidents to deepen our economic cooperation across the board in the areas of finance, economy, trade, and investment, so that we will bring up the comprehensive and mutually beneficial economic partnership between our two countries to a new high.
This is an interesting time in China, an economy that's had extraordinary development. But it is a moment that it may be shifting from an exporting economy to an economy built on domestic demand and consumption. What does that mean for the United States and the world?
Well, it's necessary for China. It's good for the world, and it's good for the United States, because China's recognized that it's now too large an economy to be able to grow based on a model dependent on exports. So I think for China's future, China's leaders have recognized that future growth has to come more from domestic consumption, domestic demand, and they have put in place a very ambitious, very important set of reforms to bring that process about, and you're starting to see it happen already, but they're at the beginning of that transition.
From the transition from an exporting model to a consumer demand model from domestic consumers, what are the challenges for you?
最大的挑战就是我们现在这个
Actually, the biggest challenge for us in this respect is to make sure that everyone is on the same page when we look at the problem. We need to come to the same conclusion that it is necessary for us to transform our economic development pattern and at the same time stay committed to the outlook of scientific development, because we have to be aware of the issue of the lack of balance and coordination in our development, and this in turn will make our economic development not sustainable.
Have you come to the conclusion that because of inflation, oil and food especially, that an appreciation in your currency might be the right thing to do now?
从某种意义上来讲，这是只是当前面临的一个问题。
In a certain sense, this is just the question we face in the immediate run. Actually, against the backdrop of a financial crisis and faced with the need to ensure steady and relatively fast economic development, the most pressing problem we are faced right now is the problem of inflation. The inflation is a problem we place a lot of importance right now in China, and it is the biggest problem we are going to tackle this year in China. In order to do this, we have to use monetary policy, fiscal policy, and at the same time, economic restructuring. And on top of that, against the backdrop of tremendous inflation pressure here in China, another thing we have to bear in mind is to ensure the livelihood of the people with the lowest income.
Do
you believe that at this point there is a real possibility for a common understanding on the appreciation of the currency?
Well, I think China's it's unambiguous. China's decided they need to let the exchange rate start to reflect market forces again, to rise in response to market forces. They're letting that happen. That's in China's interest to do. They're moving very gradually because they want to be careful how they do this.
Up 5% since June.
Yeah, about 5% since June against the dollar.
Right.
But if you adjust for the fact that inflation in China is substantially higher than the United States, in real terms, which is what matters for competitiveness, for the incentives people have about where they invest, where they build something, it's appreciating substantially more rapidly against the dollar, probably about 10% a year. And of course, that's likely to continue because it's necessary for China, so they can reinforce the strategy of moving away from exports to domestic demand and help contain the inflation pressures they see.
Can they do that without having to worry about jobs, losing jobs because of the export demand?
Well, one reason they're moving carefully, gradually, is they want to make sure that they don't undermine the capacity of the country to grow going forward. But so far, and I think this is very encouraging, you're seeing Chinese growth look very strong, really very resilient, and I think certainly from our perspective, the Chinese economy is certainly in a position where it's strong enough it can withstand the pressures that come with letting your currency rise. But I think you should look at the other way. If they don't allow it to rise, then again, the risk is that China would face higher risk of inflation going forward. But I think the leadership of China has a very sophisticated understanding of how to balance those forces, and I think they're moving in the right direction now. Of course, we'd like to see them move more rapidly, as with much of the rest of the world, and they'll come to the right judgment.
So do you think the arguments do resonate with them?
Oh, absolutely they do. That's why they're moving. Because again, China recognized it was in their interest to move. And I think you'll likely see that continue.
It is said that you were very much bothered by the U.S. economy coming out of the crisis. China was the first to recover. Do you have great concerns about the American economy?
Actually, the numbers for the American economy in the fourth quarter of last year were quite good. And in the first quarter of this year, your jobs market is improving, and we have seen good numbers about the economic growth in the first quarter. It may not be that satisfactory, but it was not bad. And talking about the American economy, I believe the housing market is the most important thing for the American economy. And this issue has not been fully addressed in the course of the financial crisis. And the housing problems are correlated with the jobs market, and I still foresee possible problems in this area. The policy of quantitative easing in the United States has brought back some confidence in the U.S. capital market, and that in turn has created some wealth returns, which has, as a result, boosted part of your domestic demand, and this is good also for the jobs. But still, I believe housing is a big issue we have to take seriously, and it has not been fully addressed.
Secretary Geithner has expressed what he would like to see happen with respect to the currency. What would you like to see from Secretary Geithner?
First and foremost, I believe what is important for the United States to do is to depoliticize economic issues with China. During my previous conversations with Secretary Geithner, I often told him that it was true that there was always a political dimension to economic problems, and economic issues are closely related to political ones, but it is dangerous to politicize economic issues. Take the exchange rate, a very simple issue, as an example. It seems to me that somehow the Americans have a view believing that China's trade surplus was all caused by the manipulation of its exchange rate. And China became a big trading country in the world simply by manipulating its currencies. Actually, this is a very politicized argument, and for all those people who really understand what the exchange rate is really about, they would not say so.
We now come to the crux of the problem, don't we?
Yeah, but I think the Vice Premier is right that you can't look at this economic relationship just through the prism of the exchange rate. Right. Obviously, it's important for China that the exchange rate move up over time as it is, and of course we'd like it to be faster.
And he's sensitive to the idea that their extraordinary success in trade was not simply a matter of the trade, of the currency.
Of course not. I mean, China's leaders 30 years ago started to put in place sweeping reforms to open up the Chinese economy, to expand the role for property rights in the market, to bring the Chinese economy into the modern era, and those reforms were enormously successful, probably the most successful period of economic reform in modern economic history. And it was those reforms, those choices, combined with the fact that China was able to take advantage of a more open global economy that was actually expanding relatively well at that period of time, that helped contribute to this rapid period of economic growth. But our economic relationship, we have our tensions. We're going to have our disagreements. There's things we'd like China to do that they're reluctant to do as quickly as we'd like. The same is true on our side. But if you look at the overall economic relationship, it's enormously beneficial to both countries now. We export more than $100 billion a year to China. Our exports to China are growing much more rapidly than they are to the rest of the world. That's likely to continue. We have a huge stake in China's economic success, as does China in ours. And of course, we want to work to strengthen that basic relationship. And I think it's important to the rest of the world that we demonstrate that we can work well together, manage the inevitable tensions we face, and still create the conditions to allow for a better growth between us and better growth for the world economy. The exchange rate is an important part of that dimension, but it's only one piece of the relationship. And of course, in the exchange rate, the Chinese authorities are moving.
You want to see them give credit to companies that are not state-owned.
We have two basic objectives. Of course, we want to make sure that U.S. companies competing with China, competing in China, selling to China, we want to make sure that they have a level playing field. Right. That's important just for the basic fairness that the system requires. But we also want this transition China's undertaking to shift from a more export-driven growth model to a more domestic demand-driven growth model to succeed. And the reforms you referred to are things that we think are important, but more importantly, the reforms that the Chinese authorities have committed to. And in this case, what we're supporting is working with the grain of the dominant direction of reform in China. And that's very important to recognize. We're not trying to push onto China things that they believe are fundamentally incompatible with their economic imperatives.
Have they implemented the things that President Hu Jintao promised here in previous conversations?
They are moving to put those in place and make sure that the message goes out all across China, to all levels of government in China. This commitment that the Vice Premier is very central to implementing, which is to provide better protection for intellectual property rights, right. To make sure as they promote development in China, they're not discriminating against U.S. companies. The Chinese, when they make a commitment, they deliver on that commitment, and they're moving forward to put those things in place, make sure they have traction on the ground, and those commitments will endure.
Are you looking for investments in the United States? Do you believe that your opportunity to invest in technology is being respected?
我们毫无疑问，现在鼓励企业走出去。
There's no doubt that we are trying to encourage more and more Chinese companies to go global. Actually, part of China's policy of expanding the opening to the outside world is, on the one hand, to invite foreign companies to invest in China, and at the same time to encourage Chinese companies to go global. And the United States is one of the countries of whose companies we would like to see in China. And for the Chinese companies, they do not have sufficient knowledge about the investment environment, investment policies, and in particular the security review policies in the United States. And given what happened to some cases related to security review in the United States happened to Chinese companies trying to make an investment here, we've got the feeling that there is a lack of transparency in your security review policies. And one of the investment hurdles for the Chinese companies trying to make investment here is that they are short of talented people. Actually, to make investment is just like spend money. It is not easy at all to spend money, and it is even harder to try to get a bigger bang of your money. So for the Chinese companies, they really face the issue of how to well spend their money. And it is very difficult for Chinese companies to have those capable people who understand at the same time the domestic situation, their particular industry, and the situation here in the United States.
You have said that the thing that could get in the way of U.S.-Chinese relations is fear, not so much a disagreement over specific policy.
I think you see this risk of Americans concerned that China's rise will come at our expense. And you see in China some concern that the objective of U.S. policy is to contain China's rise. Both those perceptions, I think, are false, and they pose risk to both of us. And I think part of what we have to do is try to demonstrate to the citizens of both countries that as we work to advance and protect and defend our interests vis-a-vis each other, that we can do that and still find a way we can grow together. And that's I think it's going to be the great challenge of the coming decades for both these two countries. And that's why we're investing so much time and effort into trying to make sure that we understand China's interests, its intentions, their values and traditions, and ask them to do the same for the United States, because that'll help us avoid the kind of miscalculations that would raise the odds of future tension.
Secretary Geithner said what Secretary Kissinger has said to me, that many Chinese believe the United States wants to contain their growth and development. Do you believe that?
Does the United States want to contain China's development? Actually, during President Hu Jintao's visit to the United States, the U.S. government and President Obama himself said on many occasions that the United States hoped to see prosperity and development in China and believed that this would serve the world and the United States. I believe in what your president said.
What do you think the biggest misconception about your country is from America in general?
美国人对中国不是误解，关键是不了解。
I don't think this is misconception. It is more of a lack of understanding.
What do you want us to understand?
因为了解中国太难，中国是一个文明古国，历史。
Well, in the first place, it is not easy to really know China, because China is an ancient civilization and we are of the Oriental culture. And for the Americans, the United States is the world's #1 superpower. And the American people, they're very simple people. If they're asked to choose to understand a foreign country, their first choice would be the European countries, and the South American countries may come second. It was not only till recent years that the American people have begun to pay more attention to China. But over the years, American media coverage of China have been scarce, and if there were some coverage, most of them are lopsided.
What do you think about this question of misconception and understanding?
You know, the thing about America and the world is that our role in the world, we took on this huge role in the world well ahead of the understanding of Americans about what's happening in the world, and that's changing now. And, you know, when I went to China to study Chinese about 30 years ago, it was a unique, exceptional thing. And now, of course, there's tens of thousands of Americans studying in China, studying Chinese all across the United States. And you're starting to see a much greater investment by Americans in understanding, you know, not just China, but all the countries that are so important to our interests. And it's come a little late to the United States, but it's changing quickly now. And I think it's very important because our capacity to advance our interests as a country will depend much more now going forward on the quality of understanding we can bring to these basic problems. And that starts with understanding, again, the basic interests and traditions, values and intentions of a country like China.
With respect, there was a story in the New York Times today suggesting that there was, despite this good dialogue taking place here, in China, a real sense of crackdown on artists and on foreign, out of some fear or some concern about the United States or some Arab Spring kind of ideas coming to China.
这种活动，我认为不可能在中国发生。
I don't think it is possible for events like Arab Spring to take place in China. That might be the conclusion of your State Department.
外交部啊，就西亚北非的形势不断地在交换意见。
I understand that there has been frequent exchange of views between your State Department and China's Foreign Ministry on the situation in North African and West Asian countries, but we've said on many occasions that it is not possible for things like for things in West Asia and North African countries to take place in China.
It's interesting to be sitting here with Secretary Geithner because he understands Mandarin. Human rights will come up in this conversation.
Of course, as always. You know, again, we have to recognize we come from different political traditions, have different political systems, and as you heard the Vice President and the Secretary of State say today, you've heard the President say in the past, we convey our concerns on these issues as you would expect us to do. But our part of these discussions are about the broader economic and financial challenges facing the global economy. And we're doing a reasonable job of trying to make sure we find the right balance between China's interests and our interests. It's not perfect. We have our moments of tension. Try to calm the tension where we can so we can make more progress. But I think we're doing a good job of trying to make sure we're expanding opportunities for both countries. And that's very important to us as we recover in the United States. Because, you know, as we come out of this crisis, we want to make sure that export growth is as strong as it can. That'll translate into more Americans back to work more quickly. And that's what we're spending all our time talking about.
If, in fact, this domestic demand develops, because China's had this extraordinary rise of a middle class with buying capacity, and that's been true in other emerging nations as well, does it offer real opportunities for American business to serve that market? And is part of the argument you're trying to make is that make sure there's a level playing field in order to give them an opportunity?
Absolutely, and you know, that's what you see happening now. That's why we're exporting so much to China already, and that's why our exports are growing so rapidly, and that's why we're so confident that if you look forward to the future, you're going to see even more jobs in the United States today created because of the need for us to meet that growing demand we're seeing in China. So again, if you look at what's happening in agriculture, in manufacturing, in services, in advanced technology, U.S. companies have a major stake in what's happening in China. Of course, we want to make sure those opportunities expand, but they matter for us because they translate directly into better opportunity for American workers as we come out of this crisis.
What is the reason for his interest in technology? Is that a national security issue, or why do many Chinese officials feel like they're not getting a fair shake?
Well, China recognizes that China's capacity to grow in the future depends on making sure they can move up that technological frontier. And so they are, they've got an incredibly creative group of scientists and innovators in China, but of course they'd like to also take advantage of technology that was designed and developed in the United States, and so they're trying to very aggressively make sure they have more access to that technology. Now, on our side, we have a set of very careful protections put in place to try to make sure that the technology that's most sensitive for our national security interests doesn't end up in the hands of people that shouldn't have it. Now, we're trying to reform and modernize those controls, and as we relax those controls, I think China is going to find it easier to access some advanced technology in the United States, but we're still going to retain and restrict access to the most advanced technologies with the greatest military sensitivity, as you would expect. But, China, is interested in more access to high technology in the United States, more opportunity to invest in U.S. companies with high technology. That's what you'd expect them to do. And I think over time, you're going to see China get more opportunity, more access in that area.
When you look at this relationship, what is your worry, or are you essentially optimistic?
My biggest worry is that economic relations between China and the United States become politicized. As the head of the economic dialogue from China, this is my biggest concern. Because once economic issues are politicized, they're no longer economic issues. If we're to look at China and the United States, the world's biggest developed country and the world's biggest developing country, the intertwining of our interests is enormous, and we face great opportunities for cooperation. Both countries have their problems in terms of transforming economic growth pattern and promoting economic cooperation. We face a lot of opportunities. If economic issues are no longer economic issues and become political ones, such opportunities of cooperation may well be lost. So the most important thing for the two of us to do is to depoliticize the economic issues and see economic relations between China and the U.S. as they are. In this way, we will truly reflect the nature of a comprehensive and mutually beneficial economic relationship between China and the United States. China has a population of 1.3 billion. Our GDP is now the world's second largest. But in terms of both hard power and soft power, there is still a big gap between China and the United States. What is even more important is that when we look at the per capita numbers, China's per capita GDP is ranking around the 100th in the world. This is something that has never happened to the world before. This is a very unique circumstance. There has never been one single country in the world with a second largest GDP, but with a per capita GDP that is ranking around the 100th. You mentioned the issue of the exchange rate. Talking about the exchange rate, there's one thing I wish to let your viewers know. In China, a lot of people have made a comparison between our economic relations with the United States and Japan's economic relations with the United States. A lot of people in the United States actually made such comparison. The five differences, among the five differences, two of them were raised by Larry Summers. When I came to the United States, he told me that When talking about
日美不一样。
China-U.S. trade surplus and Japan-U.S. trade surplus back then,
就是说，
some things
是吧？
are different actually.
日本当时
First,
在和美国贸易顺差的时候，
Japan's trade surplus with the U.S. back
高
then,
于和等于美国。
in terms of its manufacturing technologies,
而中国呢，
they were at or
都是这样。
above the level
技术上是
of
低于
technologies in the United States. It is not this case
中国的
when we
制造
talk about China-U.S.
再一
trade.
个呢，
Chinese
当时
technologies
美国
are
的
lagging
第二
behind
美国
the
的
United
消费者
States.
都能够
Second,
明确地记住
back
日
then,
本
American consumers could well remember those Japanese brand names such as Nissan, Toyota, and
等
Sony,
等。
and so on.
他说美国的消费者
But for the American consumers, they could not remember too many Chinese brand
只
names.
能记住个中国制造。
The only thing they could remember about Chinese products is that they are made in China.
啊
The
这是
third
日
difference-
本的日本央行的负责人听
Actually,
说了
this was
3个4月
told
前2条
to me by
他又加了一条
the central bank governor of Japan. He added this third difference upon hearing the two differences mentioned by Larry Summers. He told me that in the Japanese-American trade surplus,
企业制造的
most of the surplus was contributed by Japanese
而
companies
中国
solely.
中国
But it is a different story in China-U.S.
到美国
surplus.
的产品是跨
More
国
than
公司
60% of our surplus with the United States
跨国
is
公司
contributed
在
by
中国加
foreign
工
invested companies or multinationals from US, from Europe, from Japan. The
所以
products
最近的也有专家说
are
从这
simply
条来讲
processed in China and then
说是
exported
中国
to the
制造
United States. That is why
不如说
recently
世
some
界创
experts
造在
say
中国
that
制造
it is
也就是
better
说，中
to
国现在
say that products
对美
are
国的
created in the world but only made in
相当大
China.
一块
That is to say, a large part of our surplus with the U.S.
主要来自于
comes from processing trade, and the core components of those exports come from developed countries. Take the iPhone of the Apple company as an example.
对吧？在中国
It sells several $100
但是
each,
呢，最后呢，叫
but
做
only
苹果创造中国。
$30 or $40 were actually
第
created
4条
in terms of value added in China. So it was better to describe the Apple products as created in the United States but only made in China. And the fourth difference between Japan-US surplus and China-US
基本
surplus
上没有
is that
高技术产品，
the United States
对吧？禁止出口，也就是
did
说，
not
日本
have
人在
an
美
export
国
control
买什么
vis-a-vis Japan.
包括买中
That is
国
to say, it is possible for the Japanese to buy virtually anything from the United States, including planes, cannons, and warships. But this is
就是
not
美国
possible
拥有
for
的很多
China.
产品，刚才
Many of the
刚才
American
台长说了
products,
是因
as
为
mentioned by Secretary Geithner just now,
这个安全的原因
because of security reasons,
给中国。
could not be exported
在中国
to
的人民
China.
来看呢，就是说，
And for the
你
Chinese
贸
people,
易不平衡，反过来呢，你呢指责是我的汇率。
when we look at the trade
那中国
balance
人民
issue
感觉
with the
到
United States,
那你有
the
产品
Americans are
卖给我
complaining about our exchange rate.
啊
And the Chinese people are
所以呢，
saying that this is because you have your good stuff, but you will not sell them to us. So this is the fourth difference.
一
And
个很不公平
on
的
top of
就
this,
是什么
there is
现在我们
another
已
difference,
经
the
是
fifth
世界
difference.
第2大贸易国呀，
Now
这样
China is the world's second largest
第一大贸易。
trading country.
啊，在这样的情况下，
Well,
美国不
actually,
承认我
the
们
first,
完
the
全
largest
不
trading
承认
country. But even so, the U.S. has yet to recognize China as a market economy. Not even the United
在
States,
贸易顺差
the
的时候
Europeans, the
早就被
Japanese,
承认为
they
完全
have
市
yet
场
to recognize China as a
所以
market
这
economy.
条
But back in the days when Japan was
我觉得
running
应该告诉
a
你的
surplus
观
to
众
you, you
你的
recognized
观众
Japan
都是
as a
高
market
端的，
economy long
他
before.
们一想，
I agree, by the way, that the Japanese comparison is not a good comparison. I also agree that it'd be good if we could try to take the politics out of economics. It's very hard to do. Just listen to the fiscal debate in the United States. It's hard to take the politics out of economics. I think the most important thing we can do, again, is just try to demonstrate and explain that we are working to address the problems that exist between us to make sure that our both citizens in both countries view the playing field as fair and even. That's the best thing we can try and do. And I think we're making progress in that.
And at the same time, as he's said and others have said, to make sure that anyone knows that the United States is trying hard to begin to deal with its long-term fiscal problems.
Yeah, I think the very important thing for Americans to understand that by far and away, the most important factor that will determine the extent to which we benefit from China's rise will be the policies we pursue in the United States to make sure that we're strengthening our long-term growth fundamentals, better education, stronger incentives for innovation investment, and of course, restoring fiscal sustainability. Overwhelmingly, what's going to determine America's relative strength in the world, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis other countries, will be the quality of judgments our political system delivers in economic policy. And as you know, that's fundamentally a political challenge.
And have they, in a sense, recognized, has there been an appreciation of what the decisions that have been made with respect to coming out of the economic crisis?
Well, you should ask the Chinese that question. I think most people look at the United States, they saw us go through a terribly damaging, terribly risky financial crisis at substantial consequence damage to the rest of the world. But they also saw us do what Americans always do, which is confronted with crisis. We moved very aggressively to fix our problems, and as a result, we're going to come out of this, I believe, much stronger than we were before the crisis. And again, the great strength of the United States is our resilience, the speed at which we adjust, the force of reforms, the quickness of action, and we made a lot of progress, but we got a lot of work to do.
What you're seeing here is someone trying to deal with, characterize the Vice Premier for us.
Well, again, I think he recognizes that China's interests lie with the world and are inextricably linked with the United States and its other trading partners. And China's key challenge is to balance its own reform challenges, its own very substantial economic challenges, with the needs of the world as a whole. And they're going to find that balance. It's going to change over time, but they'll find that balance.
I was recently with Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. He said that you were the person that he most liked to deal with in China. He paid enormous compliments to you. He said, I hope he will stay at his position and will not retire and will be there because he's as good as he had seen.
The one I like to do business with is Wang Qishan.
I thought you'd say that. There is talk that he may stay on even though he's 65.
Well, if I were them, I'd keep him on. They haven't got anybody near him. Practical, hard-headed, humorous, quick repartee, and makes the right decisions from the Chinese point of view.
你和他见面的时候，他桌子上是不是还有一个孔子的像？
When you were meeting with him, did he still have a statue of Confucius on his table?
Yes.
我在90年代曾经到他办公室和他谈话。
Back in the 90s, I had a conversation with him back in his office. What impressed me the most was the statue of Confucius on the top of his table. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew.
这个走出了一个很独特的城市国家的发展之路。
Had succeeded in finding a path of the development of a city-state.
他既用了东方的文化，也
He made use of both the Oriental culture and the Western culture.
应该说在某种意义上，
In a certain
文化
sense,
上用东方的多，
in terms of culture, he made more use of
制度上用英国的多。
Eastern culture, but in terms of institutions, he made more use of the British system.
As I thank you for coming today, you said to me, thank Secretary Geithner. Secretary Geithner said, there he is again, looking for leverage.
It is not till now that I feel a little bit more used to this
me
way
too.
of conversation with a earphone.
Exactly.
We'll do more of it.
So we can do more?
Yeah, we'll do more of it.
we shall do this again. Good. My friends in China also say about you that you are a man who loves a quick repartee and that you're a great student of history. So perhaps we can talk more about economics, but also history the next time.
No, darn it.
That's for sure.